Hey YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Late Night Live's going to give us a replay, and they're going to have a look at the first time the Muslim Caliphate attacked Australia 100 years ago.
When I was a kid, it was very common for organisations and companies, trade unions, and certainly insurance companies to have picnics for the staff, and you'd all dress up and off you'd go and have a great day with egg and spoon races and all the rest of it. Well, 100 years ago, in fact, it was on the 1st of January 1915, about 1,200 people were loaded into 40 open ore wagons. You've got to get an image of these great lumbering wagons, all dressed up to the nines, and they're on their way towards Silverton and the annual Manchester Unity Independent Order of Oddfellows picnic. Now, they were shot at by two locals from the so-called downtown community of Broken Hill, in reality two Pashtuns from Afghanistan who flew the Ottoman flag, responding to the Sultan's declaration of holy war against Great Britain and her allies. Now, Nicholas Shakespeare, a fellow of the Royal College of Literature, former literary editor of the Daily Telly, joins me now, and he's written a very good essay about it, a monthly essay, but also a book that I hold in my hand, Oddfellows. And Nicholas, was it your involvement with Chatwin that got you interested in Australian history?
Well, I'd been to Broken Hill before 20 years ago when I was trying to research Bruce Chatwin's book, The Songline, set in the Australian desert. And I had driven from Adelaide after the festival across the interior. And I'd stopped in Broken Hill and I'd seen Pro Hart's gallery and stood before his painting, which he claimed was by Titian. And I remember the landscape very much reminded me of Patagonia, where I had spent my adolescence. It had this kind of compressing extension where the mind is forced to turn in on itself. And I think I must have earmarked it as somewhere I would long to go back to. And then 2 years ago, your wonderful writer, Murray Bale, who sometimes comes down and visits us in Tasmania, said, I think there's a story for you here that you must dig up. You're a poem who likes kind of digging up nuggets in other people's cultures, and this is for you. And he sent me a painting by the primitive painter Sam Byrne, who was from Broken Hill. And it was a painting done in 1964, and it was called Turks Attack Picnic Train, January the 1st, 1915. And it showed two men in turbans in this desert landscape firing on the train you described, a kind of 40 open ore trucks with men and women and children standing up. And as I imagined it, wearing kind of white hats and muslin dresses and holding wicker picnic hampers. And they killed 4 people on this train, and then an irate posse of Aussies got down and, aided by the Rifle Club and the local military and policemen, hounded these two jihadists to an outcrop of rocks in the north of Broken Hill, and there was a gun battle which lasted about 2 hours, at the end of which the 2 men were killed. And this seemed to be an extraordinary drama. This was before ISIS had erupted, and it was still 2 years ago something almost a kind of idiosyncratic event. But what was attractive is that it was the only act of hostility on Australia's soil during the whole of World War I. And while all your attention was understandably turned to the Dardanelles, where your Anzac forces were about to land, many of those Anzacs had come from Broken Hill, were miners from this community, who would themselves be killed by bullets from the ore they themselves had dug up.
No, I didn't realise that, Nicholas, that Broken Hill was actually making the ammo that will be used by Germans to kill Australians, and that industry or that business was closed down.
Well, I spent, after kind of having this wonderful 2 or 3 days with Murray, we went to Broken Hill, and I scratched around the surface. We found some relics, but I spent then a year back in England in the Bodleian Library, mining, in a sense, through the material from that period, using the local newspapers and books about it. And of course, it then comes into focus exactly what is happening then. And all Broken Hill's minerals, their ore and lead and silver and zinc, is being shipped to Port Perry and then to what is called the Mecca of ores, Freiburg, the great smelting capital of Germany. And so it's just an absolute irony that Broken Hill is supplying the ammunition for German forces in the First World War, which will kill many of them.
Now, the question that we ask, of course, is, do you, Nicholas, think the attack on Broken Hill was fueled or triggered by the call to jihad from the Ottomans, or did it have more to do with quite powerful racial persecution close to home?
Well, I think this is an unanswerable question, and possibly only fiction can answer it. Clearly there are differences in particulars to what we've been seeing recently in Sydney and in Paris and in London and in Boston, but in some of the broader patterns, the parallels are quite arresting. You have in Broken Hill these two men who were camel handlers in the North Broken Hill camel camp. They'd been probably in the town, as far as we can tell, because all the evidence is quite contradictory and patchy, probably about 20 years on and off. And during that time, Broken Hill was a very, very unionist town. They had clearly suffered a kind of sense of ostracism, of persecution, of humiliation. I mean, you only have to look at what Gilbert Probyn Smith is telling the West Australian Parliament in 1898. He's warning the Parliament of the perils of holy war from Afghans in Australia, saying they are traitorously disposed because they are still in sympathy with Afghans who fought Britain in the Second Afghan War. So you've already got an undercurrent of racism, of anti-Afghan feeling. I mean, when we say Afghan, it really applies to all Muslims in Australia, of whom the Afghans really were the first. They came out in the 1860s as camel drivers to open up the interior, allowing kind of pioneers to eat and drink. And so,
and also, of course, played a very significant role in building the railways.
Absolutely. One of these, the man who had the ice cream cart, Gul Mehmet, had for a time, we think, worked on a rail extension at Wilcannia, where in another kind of interesting story, Charles Dickens' son was working and had a camel train. I mean, the more you dig, you have also Anthony Trollope's son working in the same town. I mean, you go out to Broken Hill and it looks like a kind of barren desert, but almost every hillock conceals an untold story. And this seemed to me one of the great untold stories. Of course, in Broken Hill it was known about, but it hadn't yet...
Not only untold, absolutely and utterly forgotten. This is why this book is going to be, and the essay is going to be such a revelation in this country.
Well, when Murray and I went asking, it was so surprising how few people knew of this story, and it seemed to have a purchase on, even as we were in the town in 2 years ago. We came back to the Palace Hotel where Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, was filmed, and we found that as we were going out into the desert to look for one of the ore trucks and the ice cream cart, we come back to the hotel and we were told that that afternoon, two brothers in Boston had opened fire on the Boston Marathon, killing several people. And it seemed to be an exact replica of the kind of eruption that had happened 100 years ago in Broken Hill.
Yeah. Now, you make the point that the call for jihad was mostly ignored by the Muslim world at the time, except for a couple of small mutinies, one in Egypt, another in Mesopotamia.
Yes, the Germans I spoke to a professor at Oxford who was just about to publish a book on this very subject, the jihad that the Germans had pushed the Sultan of Turkey, hoping that that throughout the British Empire, which would include Australia, Muslims in those territories would rise up against the colonial power. And Germany thought this would very much help them in their battle in the First World War. Well, what happens? The Sultan announces this jihad in November 1914, and it's completely unanswered. I think a captain has his throat slit in Mesopotamia. A few months later, in February, there is a kind of uprising of sorts in Singapore where several people are killed. That's a bit hazy, the context of that. But the only other episode where we can see that the call to jihad was answered was in Broken Hill, almost at the other end of the universe.
Okay, let's set the scene, Nicholas. A hot day, middle of the desert, New Year's Day, in fact. Those first shots, I understand, were actually put down as stones pinging from the wagons. or perhaps some sort of New Year's Day salute.
Well, these two men had dressed up in the uniform, they'd homemade uniforms of the Turkish army. So they were in red jackets and white turbans, and they were flying a Turkish flag, which was red with a kind of banana-shaped crescent and a star. And I think the first sight, as the engine driver comes along the track, he sees this ice cream cart and he sees the flag, and his first thought is, oh, this is an ammunition cart and people are probably trying to explode defunct ammunition. But why would they do that on New Year's Day? And as they chug closer, the flag unfolds and reveals it's not a red flag, it's actually the Turkish flag. And at the same time, pings, as you say, against the side. One man jokes, oh, it's the Germans, and another answers, what, in Broken Hill? And they all kind of have a good laugh. And then behind them, other people are getting up and they think it's children firing at rabbits. Somebody else thinks it's them firing at a cow they can see. And then other people think it's a guard of honor to celebrate New Year's Day, and they've dressed up for this. And then suddenly they all crowd to the edge of the carriage. And then there's this young man, Clarence O'Brien, who's with his girlfriend, Alma Cowie, 17-year-old girl. And he turns around and she's collapsed in his arms and her skull has been taken away. And suddenly you have the ripple of panic along these carriages, and they realize that they are under fire.
You've told us about the younger shooter, the Camberley, who bought the ice cream cart from an Italian. The older one, Mullah Abdullah, had a bad limp, was regularly harassed by local kids who threw stones at him, and the police did little to stop it. But he was also harassed by local health authorities. What was that about?
Well, Broken Hill was, at that moment, one of the most unionized towns in Australia. And one of the unionists was a man called Cornelius Brosnan, who was an Irish sanitary inspector. He'd failed to get his certificate twice, a bit like Churchill trying to get into Sandhurst. And finally, he was given an acting certificate. And so he almost overcompensated by being zealous about proving that he was up to the job. And he just went around, up to the camel camp and would find these sheepskins on the fence and would say, why haven't you slaughtered your sheep in the municipal abattoir? And it was explained to him that actually in the municipal abattoir, the sheep are slaughtered next to the pigs, which is not in the tenets of the Muslim faith. He wasn't interested in that. And so he would find this Mullah Abdullah, who was the Garntown butcher. He finds him money that he couldn't afford. And he'd find him once already, and then he finds him a second time. And the fine is going to be enormous. His own humpy is burnt down and he's lost all his possessions. And I think that is one of the things that explode him into hatred. He's had kind of 20 years of being humiliated. And finally, he can't even practice his own religion in a way that the Afghans weren't even allowed to bury their dead in the municipal cemetery. They had to leave it to the Union gravediggers. So you can imagine the humiliation, the fury, the persecution, the sense, and suddenly it just takes a spark. Probably the jihad legitimizes it. They probably hear about it in a local newspaper. And so he and his younger colleague, the ice cream vendor, somehow, we have no idea who egged on who. There's talk of them smoking marijuana. There's talk of them being found with documents in their cummerbunds saying that they had acted, that they'd been a soldier in the Turkish army. All this is very hazy, but what we do know is that they suddenly were driven to a pitch of frustration and they decided to declare war on Australia.
Now, you imagine the events for Oddfellows, and as you say, sometimes it needs fiction to explain things to us when so little is actually known. But
okay,
do you imagine...
I'm going to start a second movie.